Welcome to episode 163 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show the public who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agents Jim Siano and Tom Baker. In this 2-for-1 episode, Jim and Tom, both first office agents at the time, review the kidnapping investigation of Barbara Jean Mackle and the arrest of her kidnappers, Gary Stephen Krist and Ruth Eisemann-Schier. The victim, Barbara Jean, was buried alive in a wooden coffin-like box for 82 hours during the harrowing incident. Jim Siano also reviews an airplane hijacking case where the pilot was shot in the stomach by the hijacker, Arthur Barkley. Jim Siano narrowly escaped the same fate when the hijacker's gun, pointed directly at Jim, jammed. Jim Siano served with the FBI for 20 years. He was initially assigned to the Jacksonville and Alexandria Divisions, where he worked criminal matters. Later in his career, he was assigned to the Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico as a hostage negotiator and instructor, FBI headquarters, and the Dallas field office as a supervisor on a criminal squad. Jim Siano was also the supervisor of the President's Task Force for Organized Crime and Drugs for 4 years. Tom Baker served in the FBI for 33 years. During his career, he served in a variety of leadership positions, dealing with terrorist and criminal challenges. He has extensive experience with police management and training issues, having served as a management instructor at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Tom Baker served as the legal attaché, legat, in Canberra, Australia, and Paris, France. Currently, he is an international law enforcement consultant and advises law enforcement agencies in the U.S. and worldwide on innovations in forensics, communications, and identification systems. He has been published in professional journals on aspects of biometrics, major case management, and police training, and has also presented before national and international forums and on television and radio concerning these topics. Doing these 2 case reviews was very interesting because these 2 cases were investigated back in 1968 and 1970. And just to learn the difference of how things were investigated back in the old days just makes me think about all of the changes that have occurred since I retired from the FBI. Before we get to the interview, and don't forget, this week for you, I recorded 2 separate case reviews. But before we get to them, I want to invite you to join my reader team. When you join my reader team, you'll get access to my FBI reading resource, which is a colorful list of books about the FBI written by FBI agents. Actually, the FBI agents who have already appeared on this podcast. There's more than 50 books there now, including my crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, and soon my newest book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives. I am so excited about Myths and Misconceptions. In each chapter, I discuss one of my top 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI and provide a reality check while breaking down the facts. Throughout the book, I use quotes and snippets from some of the retired agents about how the real FBI works. I also review popular films and fiction featuring FBI agent characters. While you're waiting for the book to be published, why not join my reader team and get the FBI reality checklist to discover the top 20 FBI myths and misconceptions? You can join my reader team at jerrywilliams.com, or if you're listening on a podcast app that supports links, you can join in the description of this episode. Thank you. Now here's the show. I am excited to introduce Jim Siano and Tom Baker. Hi, guys. How are you?
Fine. Glad to be here, Jerry.
We're going to be talking about a kidnapping case. This case is almost 50 years old. I couldn't talk to the case agents because, rest their souls, they're probably not with us anymore. So it's great that I have you here with us today to talk about parts that you played and the parts that the case agents aren't here to tell us about. So who's going to start?
I'll start the beginning, and then Tom will pick up at a certain point.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Jim.
As you mentioned, Tom and I worked this case, and both Tom and I were first office agents in Jacksonville, Florida, and subsequently we worked together in other offices. But on this particular case, the Barbara Mackle kidnapping took place in December 17th of 1968. In the early morning hours, Mrs. Mackel picked up Barbara Mackle, who was a student at the time at Emory University. She was taking Barbara home to her home in Coral Gables, Florida, and they stopped at a motel in Georgia because Barbara was sick with the flu. And it was, as I recall, very early in the morning, maybe around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, when an individual by the name of Gary Krist came to the motel and knocked on the door and said he was with the police. They opened the door, and Krist and his accomplice, Ruth Eisemann-Schier, entered the motel room, chloroformed Mrs. Mackel, tied her up, and kidnapped Barbara Mackle. They took Barbara to a remote area in Georgia near, I believe it was Duluth, and they buried her in a shallow trench inside a reinforced box. They had some air tubes in the box and also a battery-powered lamp that functioned only a short while. I believe she was in that box about 83 hours. A ransom demand was made by Krist and Schier for $500,000. Tom, why don't you pick it up here?
The actual kidnapping, as Jim said, took place at 4 a.m. in the morning in Atlanta. Later that morning, of course, the Bureau became aware of it. And then it became quite obvious to somebody in the hierarchy that these two suspects traveling from Atlanta to Miami, where the payoff was to be made, would probably be going right down the interstate through Jacksonville. So somewhere early in the day, perhaps 9 or 10 o'clock, we had an all-hands-on-deck meeting. And the city was divided up, Jacksonville, in sectors. I remember I was sent to the north, and people were sent to the east, west, and south to check out all the motels along the interstate. And at that point, we had some poor information from the mother, the description of the one man, Krist. The second person was described by the mother as a boy. And of course, we know now it was a female, Ruth Eisemann-Schier. So all that day of the Tuesday, the 17th of December, we were checking motels, really just trying to look for anything, a man and a boy traveling with a young woman who might be bound up, and alerting the motel owners to that effect, all in the end to no avail. Late that day, my recollection is around 5 or 6, late in the day, the focus of the investigation apparently had shifted to Miami, where the kidnappers would be picking up the ransom. Jacksonville, at that time, they asked to get 10 or 12 cars, big cars, to Miami, along with the agents to work the special. I was one of the 10 or 12 agents who were designated to drive a car to Miami that evening. One person in a car, because they wanted the cars as much as they wanted the agents. And then we were given very strict orders. And of course, in those days, especially being a first office agent, we followed our orders. We were told to get there as fast as possible. So it was rather, looking back on it, a hair-raising experience. A dozen of us spread out on Interstate 95, driving south at 85 and 90 miles an hour for the several hundred miles distance between those two cities. The Florida Highway Patrol at one or two points actually cut in with us, and then word got to them what we were doing and what it was about. And they actually, in a series of relays going through the night, sort of cleared a path for us, but we got very spread out. We got to Miami, and unlike major cases today where there is more of a template, a checklist to run these things by, it seemed to me it was run rather by the seat of the pants. By the time we got there, the Miami agents had been working nonstop for a long time. So they were trying to get some of them to get home and go to sleep. And we were given a lot of general leads throughout the day. Then in the first evening, early in the evening, there was a payoff attempted somewhere on the fringe of the Miami area. And it was interrupted and it didn't succeed. And the car sped off that one or both of the kidnappers were in. And I and the other Jacksonville agents were sent to that scene to search the nearby area. And I remember walking up and down the side of the road, and I didn't know who these other agents were. There were agents there from Tampa Division, Jacksonville Division, Miami, and different people were giving us orders. And then it turned out this one fellow was a man by the name of Billy Vessels, who had been a football star and was employed by Mr. Mackel, Robert Mackel, the victim's father, as a bodyguard and sort of right-hand man. And I remember walking along the side of the road and a couple of the agents saying, well, who is this guy? And then it was explained, and they said, well, has anybody checked him out? And of course, it turned out he had absolutely nothing to do with the kidnapping, but that's just our impression because none of us were really thoroughly briefed.
Let me ask you a question because,
Please.
I mean, you're talking about Mr. Mackel being able to hire a bodyguard. Can we go back a little bit and you tell me a little bit more about the Mackels? I mean, who are they that somebody would want to kidnap their daughter?
Robert Mackel was a land developer and developed quite a bit of properties down in the west coast of Florida. And as Tom mentioned, they had quite a mansion, so to speak, in Coral Gables. Billy Vessels, as Tom mentioned, was a football player and star at Oklahoma and was hired by Mackel to be his bodyguard, so to speak. I don't, Tom, have you anything else to say about the Mackel family itself?
Well, I'll say this, like so many kidnappings for ransom, which always made them a more sensitive case, Mackel was extremely wealthy with all his development. In fact, the area, which comes in the story later, off Coral Gables in Biscayne Bay in the Miami area, there is a Mackel Island that they developed. And the president at the time, Richard Nixon, either he was president or just had been president, he actually, his vacation home, or the vacation home of his friend, was actually on Mackel Island. So the president knew Robert Mackel. I believe that the director Hoover was still alive at that time. He knew who Mackel was. So you have this extremely wealthy and well-connected man. And we all know everybody should be treated the same, but in fact, when somebody's wealthy and well-connected, it does bring extra pressure to bear on the investigation.
And adding to that, what Tom said, which will come up later, an assistant director was sent directly by Director Hoover down to view and oversee this operation, and he followed the investigation all the way through to the end. And another thing is, you might think $500,000 for a multimillionaire wasn't much of a ransom, but nowadays that would probably be upward about $4 million.
Well, we know he was rich. Anybody who owns their own island named after them is rich.
Yes, yes. The first payoff didn't succeed. We searched the whole area, and then some time went by. In fact, I think a day or two went by, and it was somewhere on the 18th or the 19th that they had received and had been back in touch. When I say they, the agents who were in the mansion with the family had received further ransom instructions. And it's one of these things went so much by the seat of the pants. There was a gathering in like an open parking lot under lights, and it's my recollection is like the corner of a shopping center. And there must have been 40 of us there. And as I say, you often didn't know who was to your right or to your left, because it turned out by this time, after 2 or 3 days, most of us were the agents who had come in from other divisions, mainly Jacksonville and Tampa, because the Miami agents, they were sending them home to sleep because they had been up so long. The disadvantage of that, of course, is we didn't have the familiarity with the streets and the neighborhoods that the Miami agents would have had. Rex Schroeder, the inspector from Washington who's running the case, gets up there and gives us our instructions. Billy Vessels is with him, and this is how the payoff's going to go. They were afraid the payoff would be interrupted again. There were a lot of, not just journalists, but a lot of freelance photographers who were trying to butt in and cover the thing. So they divided us up into teams, and they said, we're going to have 2 teams. We're going to have the blocking team, which will block photographers from following the payoff car, and then we'll have the pursuit cars. But we don't want to have too many because we don't want to cause a scene. So in this very tiny neighborhood in Coral Gables, they said there'd be 3 pursuit cars initially and 3 blocking cars. And then he just stood there, the inspector, and this is how things were so by the seat of the pants, as I said, and he just said, you, and you, each one in a car, you'll be the blocking car. So I was one of the ones pointed to. And then there were other people to be the pursuit cars. So the blocking cars, we were in the house, each of us facing each other on this rather narrow street leading up to, as Jim described, the mansion of the Mackles. And it was nightfall again. And our job, when the car went by, and the car was to be a big car, I forget if it was a Lincoln or a Cadillac, that belonged to Mr. Robert Mackel. It was going to be driven by Billy Vessels, and I think that was even the kidnapper's instructions. And in the trunk was an agent, and I believe the agent was a fellow from Jacksonville who became sort of a right-hand man to Rex Stroda, the inspector, named Bill Kittle, or Billy Kittle. And he had a handy talkie, which he kept it on, and he kept narrating, some of which the driver, Billy Vessels, was telling him as they pulled out of the driveway. And we were all listening to that in our vehicles. So the thing happens, he leaves, he describes going down the driveway now, turning right, and he comes in the dark right past my car. And as soon as he went by, as instructed, I drove down the driveway that I was in, and the agent across the way, who I have no idea who he was, drove, and we touched bumpers in the middle of the road to block the road. And sure enough, screeched to a halt right then was a small car with a photographer in it. And so we blocked him. And then he backed up, and he went up on one of the lawns behind me, and I backed up the driveway again, blocking him. And this went on 2 or 3 times, up us and the other car, up and down, and him trying to get around us. And eventually, that was the end of it. Then we went forward, and we're listening to the procedure. Now, the surveillance cars, or the following cars, they were several blocks out in the main neighborhood. The payoff was successful. They turned the money over to the 2 kidnappers. And the pursuit cars, at a distance, they saw where the car with the kidnappers and their money went. And it ended in a cul-de-sac. They thought they'd be coming out another street. And of course, they obviously had this very well pre-planned. They went down the street. There was only one way into the street. It ended in a cul-de-sac, but a cul-de-sac out over the water. So the street is in a cul-de-sac, and there's a round circular wall around it, low wall, like waist high. And below it drops down to the water, to the sea. So that's where they ended up. And I estimate that I came upon that scene maybe 5 minutes after the car had been emptied, and there were at least a dozen agents strung out along the wall, all just standing there, the walls maybe waist high, just looking down into the water. And it turns out the kidnappers disappeared. Now we know later, and this will be part of Jim's story, that at somewhere around that point, they got it separated, the 2 kidnappers. And the one kidnapper with the money, the man, Krist, got away and sped off in a boat. So my story comes to an end shortly because we were all sent to another rallying point. We get to another point, and the inspector then, they had already been starting to arrange this. They said, okay, they're on the water, they're in a boat, small boat. They had a rough idea of what size it looked like. So some of us were sent to a Coast Guard station, and some of us were sent to the Marine Harbor Police there in Miami. And I was with at least one other FBI agent in a small, fast boat. I believe it was the Coast Guard running our boat. And we spent the whole night, the whole rest of the night, out in Biscayne Bay, just stopping little boats. And in the process, we actually stopped some people. They started throwing stuff overboard. Turns out they were poachers stealing from people's lobster pots. So we broke up that little ring. But after that, I drop out of the story now because it turns out that the man went up the west coast of Florida, and Jim can take over now his role.
All right. While this was going on, now this is a period of about 3 days or so. We had a meeting at the Jacksonville office, and the SAC, the special agent in charge, Bob Gebhardt, who was an excellent leader, called us, a group of agents together, and I was one of them, and he had mentioned that there were a group of Miami agents that were down in an area called Punta Gorda. They were out going from there to an island called Hog Island. And they were there for a couple of days. And as Tom said earlier, they were exhausted and they sent the Miami agents home. So the agent in charge picked me and another agent, and we went to a private airport and a little two-seater plane, a Cherokee, I believe the plane was. And we flew down to Punta Gorda, and other agents from Tampa were also going to come down there to relieve some of the Miami agents. We got there, myself and the other agent, can't recall his name, but when we got there, they teamed us up with the deputies from the area, deputy sheriffs, because they knew the area, and certainly we didn't know at all anything about it. I met with this one deputy, nice fella, and he and I got in one of these wind boats and took off to Hog Island, and we got there first. All the agents that were there previously had been sent home, as I mentioned. And this is dark. It's just probably around midnight, maybe a little after midnight. It's very dark, swamp area. As we were going toward the island, he had a spotlight on the front of the boat, and the deputy noticed some tracks and started pulling the boat over toward the shore. And he said at that time, we needed to get out into the water and approach the island on foot. And as we did, we were going through the island, and they had these mangrove trees where the roots grow above the surface. And we were picking our way through the area trying to find these tracks when we heard a noise. Thought it was a gunshot, and we followed the noise, and he and I came upon Krist, who was hiding under one of these trees. We were able to take him and arrest him without incident, and we had to go back in the water and drag him through the water. He's a pretty big fella. It was difficult walking through, as I said before, the vines that were growing above the surface made it very difficult to walk back, so we walked through the water and got back to the boat. When we got back to the boat, we took Krist to the Punta Gorda, to the mainland there, as the picture in the paper, me and the deputy at that time, Rex Schroeder, who was the assistant director, and as Tom mentioned, Bill Kittle, who was a senior agent in the Jacksonville office, took Krist in custody and into the FBI vehicle, and they took off from there.
What's the full name of the kidnapper?
Gary Stephen Krist.
Krist with a K, Krist.
And the other one was Ruth Eisemann-Schier.
Schier, the double name, is spelled Eisemann-Schier, Schier.
Well, let me ask you about the conditions that Gary Krist had been in. Had he been on that little remote marsh place in the middle of the water for a long time? I mean, what condition was he in?
He was worn out. My understanding was, and maybe this happened, Tom, when he jumped over that fence or the wall, my understanding was that he got a cut in his leg and his scrotum, and he when he got into the island, he was trying to maneuver through these mangroves. He just was exhausted. So as I said, when we got there was no problem just putting the cuffs on him. He was not in good condition. He was just he was exhausted, and you could see the picture that was in the paper where myself and the deputy took him on board. We almost carried him on the mainland.
How long had he been there?
At least a day. He's been moving around that island trying to find, I don't know what he was thinking, but he wore himself out, basically.
Not a good plan. And the woman, his accomplice, wasn't with him.
No, she was, I understand, apprehended probably two and a half months later in, was Oklahoma, Tom?
Yeah, in Norman, Oklahoma, Ruth Eisemann-Schier, she was a very intelligent person, very clever, but I think you would characterize her as very immoral person, descended from German immigrants to South America, Central America. So that's how she had that name. She was fluent in Spanish as well as German as well as English. And she had been working at this Marine Institute in Miami, and that's where she met Gary Stephen Krist. She disappeared. She wasn't apprehended until February. So 2 or 3 months later, she was working as a car hop, actually, at a luncheonette in Norman, Oklahoma, near the University of Oklahoma. And what tripped her up was the same thing that led us to the true identity of Krist, because he had been using a different name at the time of the kidnapping, was fingerprints. they took the latents that they found at the various scenes and they made it within the old identification division, a special there. And of course, everything was done manually then, but they searched the latents against everything coming in. That was like a high priority. And lo and behold, this woman, her fingerprints never having been taken in this country at that time, thought she was safe. She applied for a job as a nurse's aide at the university hospital, and they took her fingerprints, and she submitted to that. And lo and behold, after like 6 or 8 days of sorting through all of this, the identification division made the match. So they knew where she was, and that's how she got arrested.
Well, at this stage of the story, we have him arrested. We have the female accomplice in the wind. We have no idea. And poor Barbara Jean Mackle, where is she?
On the 20th of December, after he had successfully gotten the ransom money, he made one phone call, and this is worth mentioning. He called the Atlanta Field Division, and of course, in those days, the old-fashioned switchboards, the operator answered it, as was almost always the case. It was a woman, and the woman took the call from him, and he said, "I'm only going to say this once." And she just was alert enough, and she wrote this down. It was still very vague, but he said, he identified himself. He said, "I'm the kidnapper, and here's where the Mackel girl is buried." And she made notes, and then he hung up, and he never did call back. And the Atlanta agents went to that area. It turned out it was an area around a place called Barkley Lake in Georgia, rural area. They weren't clear, so they had teams digging in 2 or 3 different places. And a fellow I know now have come to know, Tom Renahan, who was also a first office agent in Atlanta, he wound up, him and some others, digging in one spot, and they thought it was a good spot to dig because it looked like it had been disturbed. And they found her buried, and they got down there, and he said it was, tried to explain this to me years later, it was very emotional for him because suddenly they got to this box and they realized that they were digging in the right place. And now by this time, she had, as Jim said earlier, she had been buried for 82 or 83 hours. So they didn't know what they were going to find. But they pulled off the lid, and there she was. And she, her eyes were open, her mouth was open, and she looked right at them. So they said, again, they were overcome by emotion in recovering her. They said she didn't seem frightened, and she didn't seem overly happy. In her own book, she said that she never lost faith, and she thought she'd be rescued. But what they later found out, the people who processed the crime scene in the Atlanta division, was that the water that 2 kidnappers had left with Barbara Jean was heavily sedated. So this was to keep her calm, quiet, and still. So she was a little bit woozy or drowsy, whatever you want to characterize it, when she was found.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. And at what stage was she found? Was she found after he was caught, or had he given this clue so that you found her at the same time as you were still looking for him?
No, I think she was found hours before him because he made the call on the 20th, early in the day on the 20th, and she was found about 2 p.m. on that day by the agents during the daylight. And I think Jim and his team, Jim, you want to jump in? It was the 21st or 22nd by the time you found him in the swamp.
I believe it was just about 1 o'clock in the morning of the 22nd when we were able to get him in the swamps.
So that makes sense. He made the call as to where they could find her after he had obtained the ransom money.
Right.
Thinking that he was going to be away in, Costa Rica or something by the time you actually pulled her out. So
Correct.
So that's fascinating. And what condition was she in?
Well, considering what she had been through, she wasn't in that bad a condition, as I understand it. And the other thing, as Jim mentioned at the outset, one of the whole reasons her mother was there, she had what they called then the Hong Kong flu. And apparently a large number of people in the whole country had that particular flu at that time. And this is December, a week or so before Christmas. So.
And I understand that Mr. Mackel was rich, but why Barbara Jean? I mean, there were so many other rich girls around the country. Do we know why he chose to kidnap her?
Well, I can say this much. The 2 kidnappers met each other and were working together in the Coral Gables, Miami area at one of these research centers. research centers. So they would have known about Mackel, and somehow they focused in on this was a wealthy target.
So does Krist plead guilty, or do you actually have to go to trial? And did either of you get a chance to testify?
No, I didn't, but all I remember was that he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, and that was in 1969. He was paroled after 10 years.
And how did that happen?
He wanted to go on and get a medical degree.
So, I mean,
he's criminal justice system at the time.
Oh my God! Because I mean, here you go, somebody who's supposed to be locked away for life, and you pardon him after 10 years.
I don't know the story behind that. And another thing which even exasperates this is the fact that when he got into the motel room with Schier, he had a weapon. He had a gun, and he at gunpoint took Barbara Mackle out of the motel room. So I don't know how that worked out, where he was sentenced to life and got 10 years, out after 10 years. I don't understand that. Isn't
the weapon an automatic 25 years?
Yeah. Of course, back then, I don't know. And Tom, I don't know if President Nixon or anything, because I think he was pardoned, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he was. And I don't know the details behind this, but I agree. My understanding is exactly what you said. He did 10 years, and then he was released because, you know what you have to say, and I'm sure, Jerry, you saw a lot of these people when you were an agent. A lot of these guys can be charming. They can be con men.
Oh, yeah.
And he must have charmed a lot of prison officials, because not only did they release him, but they released him to go to medical school. I mean, that's quite remarkable. And he did finish medical school and practice medicine for a number of years.
Yeah, he did.
Before he decided to start dealing cocaine.
Well, they revoked medical license, so he figured he'd make money by dealing cocaine.
And what happened? What was his accomplice's name again? And what happened with her? Did she go to jail too?
She was sentenced to 10 years, Ruth Eisemann-Schier, but she was released after 4 years and deported because she was never a U.S. citizen, and she was sent back to Honduras, yeah.
Well, this is definitely one of those cases that are, set for a made-for-TV type of movie. I can see it all happening now.
I'm not so sure they did. I know the book came out, but maybe they did a documentary on it. I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, it's definitely made for a movie. When you think of these there's a couple of high-speed chases in it early on with the actual payoff, and then with Jim's end of it, chases through the swamp and airboats and everything like that. I mean, it's a real action thing.
Well, somebody listening to this episode, I know there's a lot of people who are writers and authors and producers. So, maybe we've given them an idea for, a really good screenplay or script. So
that's fine.
What I'd like to know is a little bit more about both of you. Because, you're talking back in 1968, you were telling us that you were first office agents at the time. Who wants to start? If you could just give us a little brief rundown of when you joined the FBI and why you wanted to be a special agent.
Go ahead, Tom. You start off.
Okay. Well, I just had a desire to go into law enforcement. My uncles and my grandfather were both police officers in New York City. And that was my first ambition. And then the FBI was pointed out to me, and I'm glad I went that route. It's something I always wanted to do, and 33 years I stayed in the Bureau, and I enjoyed it immensely. Ironically, Jim and I became friends in the first office, and just through happenstance, we both wound up in second office agents together in Alexandria when it opened as a field office, and of course, as we all know, it's now closed. We were there for a while together, and then a few years after that, we both served together at Quantico in two different units as instructors. Jim became a field supervisor in Dallas. I became a field supervisor in Mobile at first. And another irony that ties back to this case is one of the assistant U.S. attorneys at the time was actually Jeff Sessions, who's become, who, as we all know, was the United States Attorney General until a few months ago. He was an assistant in AUSA when I was first there. Then he became the U.S. attorney. Another assistant U.S. attorney there, who later became one of his assistants, was a woman named Ginny Grenade, who actually was Virginia Grenade. She was a very good AUSA. I worked closely with her on several cases. And later, she got appointed a federal district judge. And lo and behold, in just reading some material about this case, she was the federal district judge in Mobile when Gary Stephen Krist was charged with the cocaine importation. And she sent him back to prison for 10 years. So that's wow. So it's a small world that all comes full circle.
Yeah, it certainly does.
Jim?
After I graduated from college, Seton Hall University, I went in the Marine Corps, went through officers training program. I came out and I was at the time teaching and coaching in a high school and was going for my master's degree. And while I was going for my master's degree, I met with a professor and an FBI agent, and I became very interested in the Bureau at that time. And I applied, went through the process in New York, and after training school at Quantico, actually in Washington at that time, went to Jacksonville as my first office, and subsequently as my second office, as Tom said, went to Alexandria, Virginia, and was fortunate to have another excellent leader in Jack McDermott, who was the agent in charge, special agent in charge. From Jacksonville, I went to Quantico as an instructor in the behavioral science unit. And that's when we started the profiling unit. And I was in with some of those fellows. And then from there, I went to headquarters for the inspection staff, then back out to the field to Dallas. And then the last 4 years during President Reagan's period, I was a supervisor of the President's Organized Crime and Drug Task Force. And then I retired out of the Dallas FBI office.
Well, you both have had really full and varied FBI careers. Did you guys both come in 1968 or in 1967?
I came in 68.
Yep.
Things go full circle. As I said before, when I get out of the Marine Corps and I was going for my master's degree, I was teaching and coaching, and I'm teaching and coaching now at Aubrey High School in Aubrey, Texas. I'm teaching a criminal justice class and assistant basketball coach.
You return to your roots.
Right.
Well, I was just wondering because I came in years later and I consider myself, old school, but, it's a big difference between coming into the Bureau in 1968 and coming into the Bureau in 1982 when I came in. So I would love just to hear if you could talk about some of the differences that you've seen with the FBI since you came in and currently. I take it you're still associated with, FBI people today through either the society or just, people that that are currently still in the FBI.
Well, one of the main differences, Jerry, Tom, you probably see this also, is the HRT, the Hostage Rescue Team. Of course, when we were at that time, they didn't have the sophisticated SWAT teams or they didn't have the HRT. I later on in my career became a hostage negotiator, and that was rather new at the time. Same with undercover work. I did a little undercover work, which now is expanded in the Bureau tremendously. But those are issues that back in 68, we didn't have the sophisticated SWAT teams, HRT, and that type of thing.
So would you think that this type of kidnapping for ransom case probably would have been handled by a SWAT team or HRT?
Yes, I do. As Tom said, the direction from how he explained it in Miami was fragmented. It wasn't all that organized. And of course, today with the HRT and the way they operate, I think it would be very organized. And
Tom, for you, what are your observations?
Well, I was in the Bureau until 2000. And then until just about now, I was very much in touch because since I retired, I've been on the board of directors of the Justice Federal Credit Union, which is mainly involved with the FBI. And then in my consulting business, I worked on fingerprint realm for a French company that actually did the AFIS and then the new next generation identification for the Bureau. So I was always going out to West Virginia and staying in touch with a lot of Bureau people. So I saw some of the evolution post September 11th. On a positive side, and it was something I was very concerned about, major case management has gotten a lot better for when a major case happens, a breaking case. like this or others. I saw it, and we were well trained in that. I became an ASAC in Washington field office. I was in charge of the criminal side of the House when President Reagan was shot. I directed the initial response to that, and it was just textbook work because we all had been trained together how to do this, how to set up a forward command post, how to relay things back. The Bureau was just then setting up the SIAC. It went very well, and it's only gotten better in that regard. And I understand why certain things are necessary. But after September 11th, when Mueller felt that he had to orientate the Bureau into more of an intelligence agency, it was always my experience. I served overseas in 3 different legats, and it was always my experience that there was a whole different culture, a mental attitude among the intelligence people than among the law enforcement people across all the agencies. An unintended consequence of the post-September 11th changes was that the Bureau, culturally, in the leadership ranks, became too much of an intelligence agency, where the law enforcement agency was always more rigid, swear to tell the truth, just the facts. And hopefully, Director Wray has now said that he's going to get us back to the brand. And I've heard him say that several times in several formats. And I hope maybe we can get back to our law enforcement roots.
Now, I usually ask someone for the last word. Do we want to leave that as the last word, or did anybody have anything to add?
I'll leave that as my last word.
I am excited to introduce my guest, Jim Siano. Hey, Jim, how are you?
I'm doing well. Yourself, Gary?
I am doing great. This case that you're going to talk to us about today is one that's probably been lost in history, but it is an exciting case that is right up there with Captain Sully and all the other pilots that have been recognized as heroes for saving the passengers on their flight. But this one has a little twist to it, too, because you were definitely a hero in this case, too, probably an unsung hero.
Well, I don't know about that. The captain really made a big effort to stop this.
Well, why don't we start? We can start wherever you want to start.
Well, this was my second office in the FBI. My first office was in Jacksonville, Florida, and I just come to Alexandria, Virginia, which was a new office in the FBI comprised of OPs, Officer Preference Agents from the Washington Field Office, and second office agents. This was like the morning of June 4th, 1970, and the special agent in charge, Jack McDermott, who was an outstanding leader and gentleman, got a call that there was a plane being hijacked heading for Washington. That time, he called me, and then he asked me to get a couple more agents, and we all got together and drove out to Dulles Airport. The plane originated in Phoenix, Arizona, and it was headed, as I mentioned, toward Washington, D.C. We drove out to Dulles Airport, and I was in the front seat with Special Agent in Charge, Jack McDermott, and 2 more agents were in the back of the vehicle, and we had another 2 cars behind us. We pulled up to the airport, and we got onto the airstrip. We had received information from the tower. By the way, we had an agent up in the tower by that time, and we received information that the hijacker had a weapon. He had a gun and a knife, and that he also had some gasoline. Now, how these all got on a plane at that time, they didn't have TSA, and they didn't have the type of security at the airports. They just did random searches of people, and evidently he wasn't searched in Phoenix. When the plane was in flight, we received information from the tower that the individual named Arthur Barkley had demanded $100 million, which right away raised flags with us. It was rather an unusual demand, and we knew that there was something unusual about this individual. So we told the people in the tower to radio to the plane that we would get money together and put it on the runway. Our intention was to make sure that we got the plane landing at the Dulles Airstrip. The tower advised us that the hijacker, Barkley, stated that if the money wasn't on the airstrip, that he would dive the plane into the White House. So we had agents in the airport get these duffel bags and filled it with paper and put a couple duffel bags on the runway. I had the tower radio up to the pilot, advising that the money was on the runway and that they would ask the pilot to bring the plane down to the airstrip. Shortly after that, the plane landed at the Dulles airport, and Special Agent McDermott and myself and the other fellows in the car, other agents, drove on the airstrip behind the plane so that we were not visible from inside the plane. We drove up to the rear of the plane, and at that time we got out of the vehicles and we waited underneath the plane. We wanted to see if Barkley would come out, show himself, or make an attempt to have someone get the money. Well, as we were under the plane, the passenger door of the plane opened, and we heard a gunshot. At that time, we knew we couldn't wait any longer because of the people on the plane and the other pilots in the cockpit. So I was hoisted up to the plane, and I held on to the door that was open. And as I held on to that door, Barkley came out, he fired, and he missed me. And I fired, and I hit his hand that was holding on to the frame of the door. And then I swung in, holding on to the door. And as I jumped him, he put his gun into my stomach and pulled the trigger. The gun misfired. And I was able to get him down on the floor of the plane and handcuffed. He was then taken off the plane, and we later found out that he did have a knife, and it was a small can of gasoline on the plane in the cockpit. At that time, we went to the hearing for the arraignment, and he was arraigned at that point. He wanted money. He felt that he was due money from an injury he had. He was a truck driver, and he was injured, and he felt that the government was holding back money that he felt he was owed, and this was his reason for hijacking the plane. None of the passengers were injured. Captain Dale Hoopy, who made a heroic attempt at first to try to stop him, was shot in the stomach. Fortunately, thank God, the bullet went through his body and didn't touch any vital organs, and he recuperated well after that. The weapon that Barkley used was sent to the FBI lab. They wanted to find out why it misfired when he put the gun in my stomach. And what they came back with was that this was a Rome 22. It's a small weapon, not very well made. They said that he had the weapon in his pocket on flight, and some of the hairs, fibers from his pocket got integrated with the oil of the gun, and that got into the trigger mechanism. And when he pulled the trigger, the hammer didn't go forward with enough force to ignite the cartridge. And that's what saved the gun from firing when he stuck it at me. President Nixon was friendly with the pilot, and this is why it got so well publicized in papers from around the country, actually internationally also. Dale Hoopy was a very interesting gentleman. He was very forthcoming when he talked about his activity in the plane. He at first tried to make an attempt to stop Barkley, but when he got up, that's when Barkley turned around and shot him. And that's the shot we heard when we were underneath the plane. As the plane landed, there was a couple of snipers that fired at the wheel so they would disable the plane so that it wouldn't be able to take off again. So we wanted to make sure that the plane was disabled and was not able to go in flight because of his statement that he would take the plane into the White House. That was the first thing that we wanted to do, is stop the plane from being able to take off again. And of course, the idea of putting the bags on the ground in the airstrip was an intent to have him see that we had made the effort to put the money there. And that's when the plane landed. And as I said, the tires were shot out. We would not have made any move had we not heard the shot from the cockpit, because the belief was that you don't want to entice him to do anything that would endanger the pilot or the passengers on the plane. That's why we didn't do anything at first. We waited to see what would happen, hoping that he would show himself or try to get off the plane. But when we heard the shot, that's when we knew we had to do something, because an overt act was taking place, and we had to go in there before anybody else was injured. That was the decision that we made, and that's when I got boosted up into the doorway.
This incident started when he boarded a plane in Phoenix. So let's go there.
Yeah, it was early morning because I think it was somewhere around mid-morning when we got out, maybe 10 o'clock or so when we got out there to the airport. As I said before, at that time, they didn't have the screening in place at the airport that they have today. So he was able to get on flight with the weapons that he had. His ticket was for Washington, D.C., the flight to go to Washington, D.C. So he was on the flight to go to D.C. And while in flight, he made his demands, and that's when the pilot radioed to the tower that a hijacking was in place and what his demand was. That was probably mid-morning by the time we got there, so he must have left Phoenix earlier, maybe around 7 or so in the morning.
And do you have any idea how many people were on the plane?
I believe there were maybe around 60 people or so on the plane, not counting attendants and the pilots. Another thing also, at that time, we really didn't have in the FBI, we didn't have the SWAT teams that we have today. Matter of fact, we didn't even bring body armor with us. The minute we heard, when the SAC got the message about the hijack, and we just took off. And as I said, if it were today, it would have been probably different. There would have been probably sophisticated SWAT teams out there and everything. And also back then, anytime a major incident took place, the special agent in charge would normally wait for information from headquarters on how to react. I can specifically remember what the agent in charge stated, McDermott stated, when I was sitting in the front seat with him. He said, they're 50 miles away and they're not going to make this decision and we're going to go. And that's when he drove underneath the plane, which, as I said before, was the right move. And he was certainly a strong leader.
Yeah, definitely sounds like it. So Arthur Barkley boards this plane in Phoenix.
Right. He was a passenger in the plane, and he approached the cockpit. And again, at that time, they didn't have the doors locked or anything of that nature. He just went right into the cockpit from what they said and demanded that they tell him the tower that he wanted the money or he was going to take the plane into the White House.
Do you remember more about his grievances? Because he's asking for $100 million, but it sounds like it really wasn't about the money. It was more about some issues that he had with the government.
Well, he did have that issue with the government. He was injured on a job, I understand, and he felt that he was owed compensation and didn't receive it. And but he also had mental issues. I mean, first of all, when we heard $100 million at that time, back in 1970, even now, that's an astronomical amount of money to be demanding. And as it turned out at the trial, he was sentenced to a mental institution. He was convicted, and he was sentenced to a mental institution. So he did have mental problems.
When he is on the flight and he demands this money, who is gathering? Is there any real money in those bags? Or
no. What we did is we had agents go over to the airport and get these kind of duffel bags they had at the baggage area and just fill them with money, with paper, just newspapers, just to make them look like they might be full, and laid them on the runway and had the tower report back to the pilot that the money has been put on the runway and that the plane, would come down at that time. The odd thing is we did not know what his intent was in bringing a container of gasoline on board. We don't know what his intent was for that. Naturally having the two weapons, a gun and a knife, we could understand with hijacking he would show those, but we had no idea why he brought a container of gas with him.
Well, it says here that TWA actually withdrew $100,000 in ransom and brought it to, the Dulles airport.
Yeah, the money was never brought on, but there was money that was supposedly sent to the airport that the international pilot would take on the plane to show Barkley that there was some money, and that never took place, though, because he fired the shot. He shot Captain Hoopy, so that pilot never came on board.
I'm looking at the newspaper article, which I'm going to share with everyone, and it says here that the plane actually landed. And he got the $100,000 and it took off again. They were able to convince him to return to the airport for more money. And this time, that's why they shot out the tires, because they didn't want him to leave again.
Yeah, that happened before. We didn't have that information, Jerry. That happened before we even got to Dulles Airport. So we weren't aware of that information at all. We had no knowledge of that beforehand because we were en route to the airport.
So when you first got there, had he taken off for the first time, or had he already returned?
He was on his return. He circled around. He was on his return back to get the money that he was demanding.
Wow.
We saw him circling, and then the tower said that they were going to make their landing after we put the money on the ground. But I never saw any other planes at that time.
Now, when you're talking about the fact that the gun that he had pointed into your stomach and pulled the trigger didn't work, was really absolutely amazing, because he had actually fired that gun a number of times.
Right. He fired it at the pilot when he shot Captain Hoopy. And as I was holding on to the door that was open, he came out of the cockpit. And I remember he just faced me and he fired. It just missed. And that's, as I swung in with the door, I swung right on. I just jumped on him. And that's when he pulled the trigger. And I was able to get him down onto the floor of the plane and then handcuffed. And then we got him out of there.
You were really taking a big risk, because unlike nowadays where there are ways for the pilot to discreetly communicate with the tower and letting everybody know what was going on inside the plane, you really had no idea at the time what was happening inside. You had just heard the shots fired and reacted.
Right. That's exactly right. We didn't have the benefit of knowing what was going on inside. The only thing we could know was what the tower was able to tell us. And that wasn't very much because they were only getting the information from the pilot. And of course, once he was shot, all that information stopped.
Could you describe Barkley for us? Was this somebody that, would be easy to take down?
Well, he was about 6'1", about 220, 225 pounds. He was in good shape. He was a truck driver, and he kept himself in pretty good shape. He was obviously not in his right mind when he started shooting. So I mean, he was just out of his mind, when he shot Captain Hoopy, and I could see it in his face, because I remember when I swung in, he just looked like he was disoriented and angry. I think there's a picture of myself and him in one of the papers, and you can see the look on his face that he was pretty angry.
Pretty out of it, too.
Yeah.
And you said he did suffer some injuries during the time that you were trying to apprehend him.
Well, we almost fired, I guess, simultaneously, because when as I swung toward the door, he fired, and then I fired. His hand was holding the door frame, and I happened to just hit his thumb.
And what about the other passengers? I know one of the things that you hear about so much today is brave passengers taking action when a plane is hijacked. Did anybody in the plane make any moves or attempts to stop him?
No, as a matter of fact, the emergency chute opened on the side of the plane, and passengers were sliding down the chute.
Oh, did he know this?
This was while he shot at me. The chute opened and people were sliding down the chute. So he didn't have any knowledge, because I jumped him at that time.
One of the things that I think was very interesting in the articles that I found about this incident, and I will share them on the show notes for this episode. One of the stories that I found really interesting was that there was actually a photographer who I guess would do freelance work for the Associated Press on the plane, and that he was taking pictures during the incident.
Yes, there was a photographer there, and he took some. I think he took a picture, if I'm not mistaken, while I was holding onto the door, just as Barkley came out. I think he took a picture of that.
Yeah, the one that I have is just of Barkley holding a pistol in his hand in the doorway of the plane's cockpit with the flight staff hanging around. Could you tell us more about one of the reasons that this story really took off internationally?
Well, it was a couple of reasons, I guess. The late 60s and early 70s were a lot of several hijackings took place, and most of the early hijackings that took place were people who wanted to go somewhere, go to Cuba or something of that nature. I didn't know the background, but I heard later that Captain Dale Hoopy and President Nixon were friendly from a relationship they've had for quite some time. President Nixon went over to meet with Captain Hoopy while he was in the hospital, or they met after at the White House. I'm not sure.
Well, that certainly will bring a lot of attention to your story. Yes. So I always like to give my guests the last word. So the last word is yours.
Well, I just feel that I was blessed to have the career that I had and met a lot of great people while I was in the FBI. And I was very proud to be in an organization that's considered the top investigative agency in the country. And I was fortunate to have a good career, and I enjoyed it very much.
And that's the end of the interviews. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Jim Siano and a photo of Tom Baker. There's also lots of articles about the Barbara Jean Mackle kidnapping case and the TWA hijacking case. There's a really cool diagram of that coffin-like box that Barbara Jean was buried in for 82 hours. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them listen to the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, or anywhere you listen to audio. Soon you'll be able to pick up a copy of my first nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives. Coming soon to all stores where books are sold. It's a 55,000-word expanded version of my popular FBI reality checklist. If you enjoy police procedurals, I hope you also consider picking up copies of the crime novels in my FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad series, Pay to Play, and Greedy Givers. The crime fiction series features Special Agent Kerry Wheeler, Temptation, Corruption, and Redemption. The books are available as ebooks and paperbacks at Amazon.com, and Pay to Play is also an audiobook. I want to thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.